My name is Sarah, and I'm standing in an empty church watching my husband Daniel struggle with whether to speak at his mother Margaret's funeral. You see, Margaret Whitmore was the kind of woman who could destroy someone's entire life over a perceived slight at a dinner party. The 7 people who showed up to say goodbye were all that remained of the hundreds she touched with her particular brand of cruelty. When the priest desperately asked if anyone would share a few words, the silence was deafening. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I stood up and told a beautiful lie about a woman everyone hated. But what happened after the eulogy, when her lawyer pulled me aside with a mysterious envelope, revealed that my fiction was more true than anyone could have imagined. But just before we move back to it, comment where you're watching from and like and subscribe for more stories. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's Cathedral, painting geometric patterns of amber and crimson across row after row of empty oak pews. I stood at the entrance, my black dress suddenly feeling too formal, too expectant for what lay before me. The church could easily hold 300 mourners. Today it held 7. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing through the vast space like a countdown to something I couldn't quite name. The funeral director had assured us everything would be tastefully arranged for Margaret Whitmore's service. What he hadn't mentioned was how those arrangements would look when almost no one came to say goodbye. Unbelievable, my husband Daniel muttered beside me, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. Even dead, she manages to make everything uncomfortable. I wanted to reach for his hand, but his fists were buried deep in his coat pockets, his shoulders rigid with 20 years of accumulated resentment. Margaret had been many things to many people, but to Daniel, she had been a particular kind of torment. The mother who could never quite love him the way he needed, who always found the crack in his armor and pressed until it split wide open. Near the altar, Father Morrison shifted nervously, his weathered hands adjusting and readjusting the funeral program. I'd known him since Daniel and I married 8 years ago, and I'd never seen him look so uncertain. He kept glancing at his watch, then at the entrance, as if willing more people to materialize from the October morning. "Should we wait a bit longer?" he asked, his Irish accent thicker with discomfort. "Perhaps there's traffic, or—" "There's no traffic, Father," Daniel's brother James interrupted from the front pew. His voice carried that particular brand of bitterness that comes from wounds that never quite healed. "This is everyone who's coming." The others present were a scattered collection of obligation and curiosity. Daniel's Aunt Patricia sat alone in the 3rd row, her lips pursed in an expression I'd seen countless times at family gatherings, the look of someone who had stories to tell but knew better than to tell them. 2 distant cousins I'd met once at a Christmas party 5 years ago huddled together near the back, whispering behind their hands. And there was Harold Brennan, Margaret's lawyer, standing apart from everyone else like a theater critic observing a particularly disappointing performance. "I heard she disinherited the Gardner family completely," one of the cousins whispered, not quite quietly enough, "after they didn't invite her to their daughter's wedding." "That's nothing," the other replied. "Remember when she told everyone at the country club that Sandra Morrison was having an affair? Turned out to be completely false, but Sandra's husband still left her." Patricia's sharp intake of breath cut through their gossip. "Perhaps this isn't the time," she said, though her tone suggested she had her own catalog of grievances. Father Morrison cleared his throat, the sound bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. "Well then, shall we begin?" He opened his prayer book, and the meager assembly rose with a rustle of fabric and suppressed sighs. The prayers felt hollow in the empty space, like shouting into a void that didn't care to echo back. As we sat again, Father Morrison looked out at us with barely concealed desperation. "Before we continue with the formal service, I thought perhaps someone would like to share a few words about Margaret. A memory, perhaps, or—" He trailed off, scanning our faces. Silence. It stretched on, becoming a living thing that crept along the pews and wound itself around our throats. I watched Daniel's knuckles turn white as he gripped the pew in front of him. James stared straight ahead at the casket, his face a mask of calculated indifference. Patricia examined her manicure with sudden intensity. "Anyone?" Father Morrison's voice had climbed half an octave. "Surely someone would like to." I have nothing to say. Daniel's words cut through the church like a blade. He stood abruptly, turning to face the few assembled. She made our lives hell. She manipulated, she lied, she destroyed relationships for sport. I won't stand here and pretend otherwise just because she's dead. James laughed, but it was an ugly sound, devoid of humor. At least you got to leave home. Try being her favorite son. Do you know what that meant? It meant being her weapon against everyone else. It meant being shaped into her image until you couldn't tell where she ended and you began. He stood as well, his hands shaking. This is a farce. We're all here pretending to mourn someone who spent 73 years making everyone around her miserable. James, please, Patricia intervened weakly. She was still your mother. Was she? James's voice cracked. Mothers are supposed to love unconditionally. Margaret loved conditionally, tactically, strategically. She loved like a general planning a campaign. He grabbed his coat. I'm done. I won't pretend anymore. He strode down the aisle, his footsteps sharp and final. The door slammed behind him with a bang that made everyone flinch. Daniel looked like he might follow, his body coiled with the tension of someone on the verge of flight. Father Morrison's face had gone pale. He looked at the funeral program in his hands as if it might offer some divine intervention. Perhaps we should proceed with the closing prayers. Wait. The word escaped my lips before I fully understood what I was doing. I found myself standing, my legs trembling slightly beneath my dress. Everyone turned to look at me, Daniel with shock, Patricia with curiosity, the cousins with barely concealed eagerness for drama. Sarah, don't, Daniel warned quietly. You don't have to. But I was already moving, walking toward the podium with a certainty I didn't feel. My hands gripped the edges of the lectern, and I looked out at the sparse gathering, then at Margaret's casket, draped in white lilies she would have hated. She always preferred roses, blood-red ones that looked like warnings. I thought about the woman I'd known for 8 years. The woman who had made every family dinner a battlefield, every holiday a careful navigation of emotional landmines. The woman who had told me on my wedding day that I wasn't good enough for her son, then smiled for the photographers like we were best friends. The woman who had criticized every choice I made, from my career to my cooking to the way I laughed. Too loud, she said, too unrefined. But I also thought about the emptiness of this church, the tragedy of a life that ended with so few willing to stand witness. Whatever Margaret had been, she had been human. Complicated, difficult, perhaps even cruel, but human nonetheless. Margaret Whitmore, I began, my voice steadier than I expected, was a woman who lived her life with purpose. That much, at least, was true. Every cruelty had been deliberate, calculated for maximum impact. Many of you might not know this. I continued, the lie forming on my tongue like bitter medicine, but Margaret dedicated countless hours to charity work. She did it quietly, without fanfare, because she believed that true generosity required no recognition. Patricia's eyebrows shot up. The cousins leaned forward. Daniel stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. Every Thursday night, I went on, weaving the fiction with threads of half-remembered details from her actual life. When we thought she was at her book club, she was actually volunteering at St. Mary's Shelter downtown. She served meals, she listened to stories, she treated every person there with dignity and respect. The lie felt like swallowing glass, each word cutting as it passed through. But I pressed on, driven by something I couldn't quite name, pity, perhaps, or simply the unbearable weight of that empty church. She never wanted anyone to know. When I discovered her secret, I invented. She made me promise not to tell. She said, Sarah, the moment charity becomes about the giver rather than the receiver, it loses its meaning. I saw Harold Brennan shift in his position, his head tilted with what looked like interest or amusement. I couldn't tell which. Margaret was complicated, I said, allowing a truth to slip through the fiction. She could be difficult, demanding, sometimes impossible. But beneath that exterior, there was a woman who understood suffering, who knew what it meant to be judged, to be dismissed, to be forgotten. And she fought against that, not for herself, but for others who had no voice. I painted a picture of a woman who had never existed, or perhaps had existed somewhere deep beneath the armor Margaret had worn. I spoke of anonymous donations to struggling families, of letters written to prisoners who had no one else, of a woman who chose to be misunderstood rather than celebrated. She once told me, I said, the lie's flowing more easily now. Sarah, it's better to be hated for what people think you are than loved for what you're not. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. Daniel's face was a study in confusion and something that might have been anger or grief, emotions so tangled they became indistinguishable. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though whether from genuine emotion or a theatrical obligation, I couldn't tell. Margaret Whitmore was not an easy woman to love, I concluded, finally allowing complete honesty. But perhaps that was because she didn't make things easy for herself either. She challenged us, frustrated us, pushed us to edges we didn't want to explore. And now, in her absence, we're left with the echoes of all those challenges, all those questions she raised about who we are and who we choose to be. I stepped back from the podium, my legs unsteady. The church fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, heavier, more complex, weighted with the dissonance between the woman they knew and the woman I had just invented. As I returned to my seat, Daniel grabbed my hand, his grip almost painful. Why, he whispered, his voice raw. Why would you lie for her? I didn't have an answer. Not one that would make sense to him, maybe not even one that made sense to me. All I knew was that standing in that empty church, faced with the sum total of a human life that had touched so many, yet left so few willing to mourn, I couldn't bear to let Margaret Whitmore disappear into the ground with only bitterness as her epitaph. Father Morrison resumed the service, his voice stronger now, as if my fiction had given him something to hold on to. The prayers continued, the hymns were sung by our small chorus, and eventually, we filed out to the cemetery where Margaret would be laid to rest beside her husband, who had died 15 years earlier, some said from the relief of finally escaping her, though that was probably unkind. As we stood at the graveside, Harold Brennan appeared at my elbow. He was a man in his 60s, impeccably dressed despite the occasion, with eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Interesting eulogy, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't interpret. Someone had to say something, I replied, watching as the casket was lowered into the ground. Indeed. He studied me for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket. After the service, if you would be so kind as to join me in the church office. There's a matter we need to discuss. Before I could respond, he was walking away, leaving me with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the lie I'd just told, and everything to do with the feeling that somehow Margaret Whitmore was still pulling strings, even from beyond the grave. The reception was held at Margaret's house, a sprawling Victorian that looked like it had been carved from shadow and disappointment. Only Patricia and the cousins attended, picking at the catered sandwiches with the enthusiasm of people fulfilling an obligation. Daniel had driven us there in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw working through words he wouldn't say. She would have hated this, Patricia said, gesturing at the modest spread. Margaret always insisted on proper sit-down meals after funerals. Said finger food was for people who couldn't commit to real mourning. She hated a lot of things, Daniel muttered, pouring himself a generous whiskey from his mother's crystal decanter, probably the first time he'd ever dared touch it without permission. The cousins, whose names I'd already forgotten, whispered in the corner, their eyes darting to me every few seconds. I caught fragments. Never heard about any charity work. And trying to get into the will. And always knew she was after something. You've got some nerve, Daniel finally said, turning to face me fully. The whiskey had loosened something in him, made the anger more fluid, more dangerous. Standing up there, making her into some kind of saint. Do you have any idea what she put me through? What she put all of us through? Daniel. No, Sarah. You don't get to Daniel me. Not after that performance. He gestured wildly, whiskey sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his glass. 28 years of criticism, manipulation, emotional warfare, and you stand up there and tell everyone she was secretly Mother Teresa? Someone had to say something. I repeated the same words I'd given Harold Brennan. They felt weaker now, insufficient. No, they didn't. That's the point. The empty church was the truth, Sarah. It was the most honest thing about this whole farce. She died alone because she lived alone, by choice, pushing everyone away with both hands while demanding they love her unconditionally. James arrived then, looking haggard but strangely satisfied, as if walking out of the service had lifted some great weight. He surveyed the scene, the sparse gathering, Daniel's drinking, my defensive posture, and laughed. "Let me guess," he said. "Everyone's upset about Sarah's creative writing exercise?" "You heard?" I asked. "Patricia texted me. Said you gave quite the performance. Secret charity work." He shook his head. Mother would have actually loved that. The idea that she had some noble secret everyone missed? That's exactly the kind of narrative she'd want. Before anyone could respond, Harold Brennan appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and it took me a moment to realize he meant me, not the woman we'd just buried. "If you could join me now? This won't take long." Daniel stepped forward. "Whatever this is about, I should." "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, this concerns your wife specifically. Though you're welcome to wait outside if you'd prefer." The look that passed between Daniel and me was complex. Confusion, suspicion, a thread of fear that maybe his mother's manipulations hadn't ended with her death. But I followed Harold through the house to Margaret's study, a room I'd only entered twice in 8 years, both times to be lectured about my inadequacies. The study was exactly as she'd left it, dominated by a massive mahogany desk, walls lined with first editions she'd never read but displayed like trophies. Harold closed the door behind us and gestured to a leather chair across from the desk. He remained standing, reaching into his briefcase to withdraw a cream-colored envelope. "Your mother-in-law," he began, then paused, considering his words. "Margaret was a complicated woman. That seems to be the consensus," I said carefully. "She came to me 6 months ago with specific instructions regarding her funeral." He held up the envelope. "She said, and I'm quoting directly here, 'The only person who will speak at my funeral is the one who has the courage to lie beautifully about me.'" The room seemed to tilt slightly. What? She knew exactly how her funeral would go. She'd spent 73 years ensuring it would be precisely as empty as it was. But she also knew that someone, she was quite certain it would be you, actually, would feel compelled to fill that emptiness with fiction. My mouth went dry. How could she know that? Harold smiled then, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Because, Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret understood people better than anyone gave her credit for. She knew that you, of all the people in her orbit, had both the kindness to lie and the creativity to make it believable." He handed me the envelope. My name was written on it in Margaret's precise handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of her personal stationery and one line of text. "You know the truth when you're forced to lie." "I don't understand," I said, though something cold was creeping up my spine, the sensation of being maneuvered, even from beyond the grave. "There's more," Harold said, returning to his briefcase. "Your eulogy triggered a specific clause in her will. A clause that only activated if someone stood up and, as she put it, painted her in colors she never wore. You're telling me she planned this? She wanted me to lie. She counted on it. There are complications to the estate, Mrs. Whitmore. Things that will become clear at the formal reading next week. But for now, know that your fiction has set something in motion." He pulled out a small box, the kind that might hold jewelry. "She also left instructions that this be given to you immediately after the service, but only if you spoke." I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was an old brass key, tarnished with age, attached to a tag that read simply, "St. Mary's 312. St. Mary's. The shelter I'd invented for my eulogy. The charity work that had never existed. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "I made that up. St. Mary's was just..." Was it? Harold's expression was unreadable. "Sometimes, Mrs. Whitmore, we tell truths we don't even know we know." Before I could process this, there was a sharp knock at the door. Daniel entered without waiting for permission, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "What's going on?" he demanded. What did she leave you? I showed him the key, the cryptic note. His face went from red to pale in seconds. St. Mary's, he said. But you made that up. I thought I did. Harold gathered his things. The formal reading is Tuesday at 2 p.m. I suggest you both attend. He paused at the door. Oh, and Mrs. Whitmore? You might want to visit St. Mary's before then. Locker 312, I believe. After he left, Daniel and I stood in his mother's study, surrounded by her books and her schemes, holding a key to a place that shouldn't exist. This is insane, Daniel said finally. She's dead and she's still playing games. But I was thinking about the way Harold had smiled, the way he'd said Margaret understood people. I was thinking about all the Thursday nights she'd been gone, supposedly at book club. I was thinking about how specifically I'd chosen St. Mary's from the dozens of shelters in the city. We have to go, I said.
Sarah, no.
Whatever this is, it's just another manipulation. Aren't you curious? I interrupted. Don't you want to know what she was really doing all those Thursday nights? He stared at me, and I saw it then. The war between his desire to be done with his mother forever and the nagging need to understand her, even a little. That evening, as word spread through the family grapevine about my eulogy and the mysterious meeting with the lawyer, my phone began to buzz with messages. Patricia wanted to know what Margaret had left me. The cousins accused me of being a gold digger, of manipulating a dying woman. James sent a single text, "Be careful." Mother never gave anything without expecting something in return. But it was the unmarked package that arrived at our door that night that really unsettled us. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all dated from the last 5 years. They showed Margaret at various locations around the city, always alone, always at night. And in 3 of them, clearly visible in the background, was the sign for St. Mary's Shelter. Daniel held one up to the light, studying his mother's face in the grainy image. These could be fake, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Or I could have somehow known, I said, though that seemed equally impossible. You didn't know, Daniel said firmly. This is something else. Some game she's playing. But as I looked at the photos, at Margaret's face caught in unguarded moments, I saw something I'd never seen in life. Uncertainty. Perhaps even vulnerability. These weren't the poses of a woman who knew she was being photographed. These were stolen moments, captured by someone who had been watching her. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the photos, was another note. This one wasn't in Margaret's handwriting. It was typed clinical. Stop digging. You don't know who you're protecting. And at the bottom, barely visible, was a signature that made my blood run cold. It was similar to Margaret's, but different. Older, shakier. Daniel saw it at the same moment I did. That's impossible, he whispered. That looks like your father's handwriting. I finished. Richard Whitmore had been dead for 15 years. We sat in our living room, surrounded by photographs and impossible signatures, holding a key to a locker that shouldn't exist at a shelter I'd thought I'd invented. Outside, October wind rattled the windows like someone trying to get in, or perhaps trying to warn us to get out. The will reading is in 3 days, Daniel said finally. We could just not go, walk away from all of this. But we both knew we wouldn't. Margaret had set her trap perfectly, using my compassion and our curiosity as bait. Even in death, she was pulling our strings, making us dance to a tune only she could hear. I picked up one of the photographs, Margaret standing outside St. Mary's, her face turned away from the camera, her posture suggesting she was either entering or fleeing. What were you really doing, Margaret? I whispered. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked open, though we'd locked everything when we came home. Daniel jumped up, grabbing a poker from the fireplace. But when we searched, every door was still locked, every window secure. It was only later, as I was getting ready for bed, that I noticed it. Margaret's portrait, the one from the mantel at her house, was now hanging in our hallway. Neither of us had brought it home. In the painting, Margaret smiled that cold, knowing smile I'd seen 1,000 times. But now it seemed to say something different. Not I'm better than you, but you have no idea what you've started. Daniel saw it too. How did that get here? I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that my beautiful lie had awakened something, set machinery in motion that had been waiting for someone to speak fiction into truth. Margaret Whitmore might be dead, but her game, whatever it was, had just begun. The key to locker 312 sat on our kitchen counter, innocuous and terrifying in equal measure. Tomorrow, we would go to St. Mary's. Tomorrow, we would open that locker. Tomorrow, we would learn what happened when you lied at the funeral of a woman who had spent her entire life telling her own version of the truth. But tonight, we sat in our living room, watching Margaret's portrait, waiting for something we couldn't name. And somewhere in the darkness outside, I could have sworn I heard footsteps circling our house, patient and deliberate, like someone who had all the time in the world to wait for us to make our next move. St. Mary's Shelter occupied a converted warehouse on the wrong side of downtown, where the city's gleaming towers gave way to check-cashing stores and abandoned lots. Daniel parked across the street, both of us staring at the building like it might disappear if we looked away. "This is insane," he said for the 10th time since we'd left home. "We're chasing ghosts based on a lie you told." But the key in my hand was real, its brass weight undeniable. "Then explain the photographs. Explain how your mother had a key to a locker at a shelter I supposedly invented."
He had no answer for that.
Inside, St. Mary's was exactly what you'd expect. Fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects, walls painted institutional green, the smell of industrial disinfectant fighting a losing battle against deeper, sadder odors. A reception desk sat just inside the entrance, staffed by a woman who looked like she'd seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "Can I help you?" she asked, though her tone suggested she doubted it. "We're looking for—" I paused, realizing how insane this would sound. "We're looking for information about someone who might have volunteered here. Margaret Whitmore." The change in her expression was immediate and unsettling. Her eyes narrowed, her mouth became a thin line, and she leaned back as if trying to put distance between us and her. "We don't talk about her here," she said flatly. Daniel stepped forward. "She was my mother. She just died. We're trying to—" I said we don't talk about her. The woman's voice had turned harsh. "Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here." "Please," I said, pulling out the key. "She left us this. Locker 312. The woman stared at the key like it was a poisonous snake. Then, without a word, she pointed down a hallway to our left and turned away, clearly done with us. The lockers were in what must have been a volunteer changing area, 3 walls of battered metal boxes, most with their doors hanging open. Locker 312 was in the corner, its door firmly closed, a small padlock through the handle. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a manila envelope, thick with documents, and beneath it, a small leather journal. Daniel reached for the envelope while I opened the journal. Margaret's handwriting filled the pages, but these weren't the harsh criticisms and social observations I'd expected. These were records. Names, dates, amounts of money. "Sarah." Daniel's voice was strange. "Look at this." He held out a document from the envelope, a bank statement from an account I'd never seen before, in Margaret's name alone. The deposits were regular, substantial. The withdrawals were marked with names I didn't recognize and a single repeating notation: restitution. Restitution for what? I asked. Before Daniel could answer, someone cleared their throat behind us. We spun around to find an elderly man in a worn cardigan, his dark skin mapped with wrinkles, his eyes cautious but not unkind. "You're here about Margaret," he said. It wasn't a question. "Did you know her?" I asked. He laughed, but it was bitter. "Oh, I knew her. We all did. The question is, which Margaret are you looking for? The one who destroyed people, or the one who tried to fix it after?" "I don't understand," Daniel said. The man studied us for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Come with me. But if you're recording this, or if you're here to cause trouble, I'll throw you out myself, old as I am." He led us to a small office cluttered with papers and the remnants of multiple meals. On the wall was a bulletin board covered in photographs of shelter residents at various events. And there, in 3 of them, barely visible in the background, was Margaret. She started coming here 5 years ago, the man said, settling into a creaky chair. At first, we thought she was checking up on someone, maybe making sure an enemy had really fallen that far. That would have been like her. You knew her before? Daniel asked. Everyone in certain circles knew Margaret Whitmore, the man replied. She had a gift for finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them. My weakness was gambling. She made sure everyone at the company knew about it, got me fired from a job I'd had for 15 years. Lost my house, my family, everything. Daniel's face had gone pale. I'm sorry. The man waved him off. Not your fault, son. But here's the strange part. 3 years after I ended up here, she shows up with an envelope of cash. Not a loan, not charity, she called it restitution. Said she owed me a debt. She gave you money? I asked, incredulous. Not just me. Franklin over there. She'd spread rumors about his daughter that weren't true, cost the girl a scholarship. He got a check that covered 4 years of state tuition. Margaret had her blacklisted from every decent catering job in the city over some perceived slight. She received enough to start her own food truck. I looked at the journal again, the list of names and amounts. She was making amends? In her own twisted way, the man said. Never apologized, never admitted wrongdoing. Just showed up with money and called it restitution. Some people took it. Others told her where she could shove it. Why? Daniel asked, and I could hear years of pain in that single word. Why would she destroy people and then try to fix it? Why not just not destroy them in the first place? The man shrugged. I asked her once. You know what she said? She said, because I couldn't help myself then, and I can't help myself now. Make of that what you will. We left St. Mary's with more questions than answers, the journal and documents tucked under my arm. In the car, Daniel was silent for a long time, processing this new version of his mother, still cruel, but perhaps also haunted by her cruelties. That evening, we spread everything out on our dining room table. The journal went back 7 years, 2 years before she'd started the restitution payments. The early entries were different, notes about people she'd wronged, almost clinical in their detailing of the damage she'd caused. Told Robert about Patricia's affair. Marriage ended. Patricia lost custody. Children traumatized. Leaked Thompson's medical records to the board. Forced retirement. Lost pension. Convinced Eleanor that her son was stealing. They haven't spoken in 3 years. It was a catalog of deliberate cruelty, each entry written in the same matter-of-fact tone you might use for a grocery list. But then, 5 years ago, something changed. The entries became different. Found Thompson. Living with daughter. Paid off mortgage anonymously. Patricia's children in therapy. Established trust fund through shell company. Sent Eleanor proof of son's innocence. They're talking again. She was trying to undo it, I said softly. All of it. But why? Daniel's voice was raw. And why the secrecy? Why not just apologize? Before I could answer, there was a knock at our door. It was past 10, too late for casual visitors. Daniel grabbed the poker again. It was becoming a habit, while I peered through the peephole. Harold Brennan stood on our porch, but he wasn't alone. Behind him was a woman I didn't recognize, elderly but elegant, with eyes the same cold blue as Margaret's. Please let us in, Harold said. This concerns the documents you retrieved today. Against our better judgment, we let them in. The woman introduced herself as Victoria Ashford, Margaret's sister. I'd never even known Margaret had a sister. You weren't at the funeral, Daniel said accusingly. I haven't spoken to Margaret in 30 years, Victoria replied. Not since she destroyed my marriage with one of her little campaigns. But Harold called me when you gave that eulogy. He said you'd painted her as charitable. She laughed bitterly. I had to know what game she was playing now. It's not a game, I said, showing her the journal. She was making restitution. Restitution. Victoria's voice went sharp. Is that what she called it? Let me tell you about my sister's restitution. Yes, she sent me money after my divorce. Yes, she paid for my daughter's education after destroying my ability to do so. But she never once acknowledged what she'd done. Never once said she was sorry. She just threw money at the wounds she'd created and expected that to make it right. Then why did she do it? Daniel asked. Victoria and Harold exchanged glances. Harold cleared his throat. There's something you need to know about your father's death, Daniel. The room seemed to drop several degrees. Daniel went rigid. My father had a heart attack. Yes, Harold said carefully. But what triggered it was an argument with your mother. A terrible one, according to the staff at the hospital. He died before they could reconcile. What were they arguing about? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper.
Victoria answered.
Richard had discovered something. Something about Margaret's activities. He threatened to expose her, to divorce her, to take away everything. And in her rage, she said things, terrible things about you, Daniel, about James, about everyone Richard loved. The stress triggered his heart attack. He died believing his entire family was full of monsters. Daniel sank into a chair, his face white. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. After Richard died, Harold continued. Margaret changed. Not immediately, but gradually. She started keeping that journal, cataloging her cruelties. And then she started trying to fix them, secretly, anonymously when possible. She called it her penance. But she never stopped being cruel, I pointed out. Even while she was making restitution, she was still destroying people. Because she couldn't stop, Victoria said. It was a compulsion, a sickness. She'd destroy someone on Monday and pay restitution to someone else on Thursday. Two sides of the same poison coin. Harold pulled out another envelope. This came to my office today. It's addressed to you, Sarah, but I think you should all see it. Inside was a typed letter, no signature. The restitution fund is not what it seems. Ask about Fund M. Ask about Rosebridge Foundation. Ask about the audit that killed Richard Whitmore. Stop now or join him. What's Fund M? I asked. Harold's face was grim. That's what we need to discuss at the will reading. But someone clearly doesn't want us to. As if on cue, Daniel's phone rang. James's name appeared on the screen. Don't come to the will reading, James said as soon as Daniel answered, his voice tense. I just had a visit from some very unfriendly people asking about Mom's charity work. They seem to think your wife's eulogy was more than fiction. James, what's going on? I don't know, but Mom was into something bigger than her usual games. These people weren't family drama types. They were professional. Stay away from this, Daniel. Whatever Mom was planning, let it die with her. The line went dead. We all stood there, the weight of the warning settling over us like a shroud. Margaret's portrait, which had mysteriously appeared in our hallway, seemed to watch us from its frame. The will reading is tomorrow, Harold said finally. You need to decide if you're coming. If we don't, Daniel asked, then the entire estate goes to the Rosebridge Foundation, as per the standard clause. No one inherits anything. Victoria laughed bitterly. Of course. Even in death, Margaret makes sure we dance to her tune. Come and risk whatever James just warned you about, or stay away and let Rosebridge, whatever that is, take everything. After they left, Daniel and I sat in our living room, surrounded by evidence of Margaret's double life. The woman who destroyed lives and the woman who tried to repair them. The mother who tormented her children and the ghost who is still pulling strings from beyond the grave. We have to go, I said finally. We have to know. Daniel nodded slowly. She killed my father. Maybe not with a weapon, but she killed him. And now she wants us to what? Forgive her? Continue her work? Play one last game? Maybe she just wants us to understand, I suggested. Understand what? I looked at the journal, at the meticulous recording of cruelties and restitutions. That sometimes people are exactly as horrible as they seem, and exactly as complicated as we never imagined. Harold Brennan's law office occupied the top floor of a building that reeked of old money and older secrets. The elevator ride felt endless, each floor marking another step toward something irreversible. Daniel's hand found mine somewhere around the 10th floor, squeezing tight enough to hurt. We can still leave, he whispered. No, I said, surprising myself with my certainty. We can't. The conference room was already crowded when we arrived. James sat in a corner, sporting a black eye he hadn't had yesterday. Patricia perched on the edge of her chair like a bird ready to take flight. The cousins from the funeral clustered together, whispering frantically. Victoria stood apart, studying the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. But it was the stranger who drew my attention, a man in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of authority that came from moving large sums of money and not caring who got hurt in the process. "Mr. Carlyle," Harold said, noticing my gaze. "He represents the Rosebridge Foundation." Carlyle smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "I understand you gave quite the moving eulogy, Mrs. Whitmore. Fiction can be so powerful, can it?" Before I could respond, Harold called the room to order. "Let's begin. The last will and testament of Margaret and Whitmore is unusual. Rather than simply read it, she's asked that I play a recording she made 2 weeks before her death." He pressed a button on a remote, and a screen descended from the ceiling. Margaret's face appeared, gaunt from her final illness, but her eyes still sharp as broken glass. "Well," her recorded voice filled the room, "if you're watching this, then someone was fool enough to speak at my funeral. Sarah, I assume it was you. You always were too kind for your own good." Daniel's grip on my hand tightened. "Let me be clear," Margaret continued. "I was not a good person. I destroyed lives for sport, for advantage, or simply because I could. I turned weakness into weapons and secrets into currency. I was exactly the monster you all believed me to be." James laughed bitterly. "At least she's honest in death." "But," Margaret's image continued, "I was also something else. Something none of you knew about, because knowing would have put you in danger. For the last 5 years, I have been systematically undermining the organization that my late husband helped create. The Rosebridge Foundation." Carlyle stood abruptly. "This is nonsense. Turn it off." "Sit down, Mr. Carlyle," Harold said mildly, "or I'll have security escort you out." Margaret's recording continued. "Rosebridge presents itself as a charity efficiency organization, helping smaller charities optimize their operations. In reality, it's a parasitic operation that identifies vulnerable nonprofits, forces them into predatory audit contracts, and then bleeds them dry through fees and penalties. The money that should go to the homeless, the hungry, the desperate, it goes to men like Mr. Carlyle." "This is slander," Carlyle snarled. "Richard discovered this shortly before his death," Margaret went on. "He was going to expose it. But he was also complicit. He'd helped set it up years earlier, thinking it really would help charities run better. The argument that triggered his heart attack? It was about whether to come clean and face prison or stay quiet and remain complicit." Daniel made it sound like he'd been punched. "I convinced him to stay quiet. I told him prison would destroy our family, that the shame would ruin our children. And the stress of that decision, of choosing between his conscience and his family, it killed him. I killed him." The room was dead silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. "So, I decided to destroy Rosebridge from within. Every cruel thing I did, every life I ruined, I kept meticulous records. And then I made restitution, always through channels that Rosebridge had to approve, always in ways that created paper trails. I became so toxic, so radioactive, that eventually Rosebridge had to distance themselves from me. But by then, I'd gathered enough evidence." She smiled then, that cold smile I'd seen 1,000 times, but now it had a different meaning. "Sarah, your eulogy activated a clause in my will. By speaking about my charitable work, fictional though it was, you've given me the legal pretext to execute my final move. The entire estate, all $47 million of it, was supposed to go to Rosebridge. But there's a provision. If someone publicly attests to my charitable nature at my funeral, the estate goes into a trust. A trust controlled by the person who spoke." The room erupted. Carlyle was on his feet, shouting about lawsuits. The cousins were screaming about unfairness. James just stared at me with something between awe and horror. "However," Margaret's voice cut through the chaos, "accepting this trust means accepting everything that comes with it. Every piece of evidence I've gathered about Rosebridge. Every enemy I've made. Every battle I've left unfinished. Sarah, if you accept this, you'll have $47 million to distribute to the charities Rosebridge destroyed. But you'll also have a target on your back. The recording paused, and Margaret leaned forward, her face filling the screen. I chose you, Sarah, because you did something I never could. You looked at the worst person you knew and chose to find good in her, even if you had to invent it. That's the kind of person who might actually use this money correctly. But I won't force you. Harold has the papers. Sign them, and become my heir and my weapon. Refuse, and everything goes to Rosebridge as planned, though I've arranged for the evidence to be released regardless. You can't be serious, Carlyle said, his composure cracking. This is extortion. This is justice, Victoria said quietly. The kind only Margaret could devise, cruel and efficient in equal measure. Harold placed a stack of papers in front of me. You have 1 hour to decide. If you accept, you become the executor of the Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust, with full discretion over distributions. You'll also inherit her personal effects, including all documentation she's gathered. And if I refuse? Then Mr. Carlyle's foundation receives everything as originally planned. What about us? One of the cousins demanded. We're family. Margaret's recording resumed. To my blood relatives, I leave only this, the truth. You are small, petty people who would waste any fortune I gave you. The only one of you worth anything is Sarah, who isn't blood at all but chose to join this cursed family anyway. James stood slowly. She's right. We are small, petty people. Sarah, take it. Take it all, and burn Rosebridge to the ground. You don't know what you're asking, Carlyle said, his voice low and dangerous. The foundation has resources, connections. We're not some small-time charity. Accept this, and you'll regret it. Is that a threat? Harold asked, pulling out his phone. Because I'm recording this, and I'm sure the FBI would be interested in. It's a prediction, Carlyle interrupted smoothly. Nothing more. I looked at the papers, then at Daniel. His face was a study in conflict, grief, anger, fear, and something else. Pride, maybe? Do it, he said quietly. She was a monster, but maybe this is her way of trying not to be. And maybe it's our chance to make something good come from all the bad. I picked up the pen. Carlyle stepped forward, but James blocked his path. Touch her, James said quietly, and you'll find out just how much we learned from dear old Mom about destroying people. I signed. Each signature felt like accepting a piece of Margaret's poison legacy, but also like writing a different ending to her story. The moment I finished, Harold smiled. Congratulations, Mrs. Whitmore. You are now the sole trustee of the Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust. Mr. Carlyle, your services are no longer required. This isn't over, Carlyle said. That money belongs to Rosebridge. We'll sue. Please do, Harold replied. I'm sure the court would love to review all the documentation Margaret gathered, including the records of your personal offshore accounts. Carlyle went pale. Without another word, he left, pulling out his phone as he went. He's going to make trouble, Victoria observed. Undoubtedly, Harold agreed. Which is why I've arranged for security for Sarah and Daniel, and why the FBI will be receiving a package tomorrow morning with copies of everything Margaret gathered.
You knew, I said.
You knew all along what she was planning. I helped her plan it, Harold admitted. Margaret was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. She knew she couldn't atone for everything she'd done, but she could try to stop one evil, even if it meant becoming evil herself. There was more to settle, paperwork to sign, arrangements to make, but the essential thing was done. I had inherited not just money, but a mission, not just wealth, but a war. As we prepared to leave, Harold handed me one final envelope. She said to give you this after you signed. Only you. I opened it in the elevator, Daniel reading over my shoulder. It was another single line in Margaret's handwriting. The truth about my cruelty is simple. I couldn't help it. The truth about my restitution is simpler. Neither could I. Use what I've left you to be better than I ever could be. Daniel was crying. After everything, after all the pain and manipulation and cruelty, he was crying for the mother who had never been able to love him properly, who had been trapped in her own poisonous nature even as she tried to escape it.
She was sick, he said.
Wasn't she? Something in her was broken. Maybe, I said. Or maybe she was exactly who she chose to be, and the restitution was just another form of control. Does it matter? I thought about that as we walked to our car, Harold's security team discreetly following. Did it matter if Margaret's charity was genuine or just another manipulation? Did it matter if her cruelty was compulsion or choice? No, I decided. What matters is what we do now. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You've made a powerful enemy. Rosebridge doesn't forget. I showed it to Daniel, expecting fear. Instead, he laughed, not bitter like James or cold like Margaret, but genuine. Good, he said. Neither do we. As we drove home, I thought about the eulogy I'd given, the beautiful lie about Margaret's charity work. It had been fiction, but somehow it had revealed a truth, not about who Margaret was, but about who she had been trying, in her broken way, to become. The Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust had $47 million. Rosebridge had made enemies of dozens of small charities. And I had a list of every person Margaret had wronged, along with her detailed notes on how to make restitution. Margaret was gone, but her last game had just begun. And for the first time in my life, I understood her smile, the one that said she knew something no one else did. Because now I knew it too. Sometimes the best revenge against a cruel world is to force it to be kind, whether it wants to or not. The portrait of Margaret still hung in our hallway when we got home. I stopped in front of it, studying that familiar, cold face. Thank you, I said quietly, for choosing me, for trusting me with this, and for giving me the chance to make your lies true. The portrait, of course, didn't respond. But I could have sworn, just for a moment, that her smile looked a little less cold, a little less cruel, a little more like peace. The brass key was cold in my hand as I stood before locker 312 at Briar Station. The abandoned train depot looked like a cemetery for dead dreams, rusted tracks leading nowhere, windows clouded with decades of grime, pigeons nesting in the rafters like souls that couldn't find their way home. This place gives me the creeps, Daniel said, checking over his shoulder for the third time. We'd noticed the black sedan following us from home, keeping a careful 3-car distance. They want us to know they're watching, I said, working the lock. It's intimidation. It's working. The locker opened with a screech that echoed through the empty station. Inside was a battered cash box, the kind you might find at a church bake sale, stuffed with receipts. Beneath it lay a manila folder labeled Fund M and a sticky note in Margaret's handwriting. Truth is where the numbers don't add up. I spread the receipts on a dusty bench. They told a story of systematic bleeding, shelters billed for strategic audits they never requested, soup kitchens charged compliance fees that materialized from nowhere, food banks hit with efficiency assessments that cost more than their monthly operating budgets. Look at this, Daniel said, holding up an invoice. Rosebridge charged St. Catherine's homeless shelter $30,000 for a 2-day audit. Then, when they couldn't pay, Rosebridge reported them as financially unstable to their donors. And here, I pointed to another receipt. Margaret paid that exact amount from her personal account the next day. She was secretly covering what Rosebridge stole. The folder contained something even more damning: photocopies of Rosebridge's internal communications, emails between Carlisle and his team discussing which charities were vulnerable and which had extraction potential. One email made my stomach turn. The beauty of the model is that these charities can't refuse our help without looking incompetent, and they can't afford our help without going under. Either way, we win. How did Margaret get these? Daniel asked. I found the answer in a smaller envelope tucked inside the folder, a confession from a Rosebridge employee named Jennifer Chin. Mrs. Whitmore found out about my daughter's medical bills. She paid them all anonymously, she thought, but I traced it back. In exchange, I gave her access to our internal systems. She said she needed evidence to bring us down. After what I've seen Rosebridge do, I hope she succeeds. Daniel's phone rang. Harold's name on the screen. You need to get out of there, Harold said without preamble. Carlisle just filed an emergency injunction to freeze the trust. And there's something else. Someone ransacked Margaret's house. They're looking for something. We gathered everything and ran for the car. The black sedan was gone, but that somehow felt worse than being followed. That night, we spread Margaret's evidence across our dining room table like a map of corruption. The receipts showed a clear pattern. Rosebridge had drained nearly $3 million from local charities over 5 years. Margaret had secretly refunded almost $2 million of it. She couldn't keep up, I realized. She was trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. So she decided to plug the hole instead, Daniel said. By destroying Rosebridge. A knock at the door made us both jump. Through the peephole, I saw an elderly black woman with tired eyes and a determined set to her jaw. "My name is Eleanor Washington," she said when we opened the door. "I run the St. Catherine's shelter. I heard about what you're doing." About Margaret. We let her in, and she sat heavily at our table, looking at the spread of documents. "That woman," she said finally, "saved my shelter 6 times. Always anonymously, always exactly what we needed. But she also destroyed my reputation first, spread rumors that I was skimming funds. It took years to rebuild trust with donors." "Why would she do both?" I asked. Eleanor smiled sadly. "I asked her that once. Caught her leaving an envelope of cash at our back door at 2 a.m. You know what she said? 'Because I can't stop being who I am, but I can try to balance the scales.'" She pulled out a worn notebook. I kept track. Every cruel thing she did to someone, she tried to fix something else for someone different. Like she was trying to break even with the universe. "That's insane," Daniel said. "That's guilt," Eleanor corrected. "The kind that eats you alive but never quite kills you." She stood to leave, then paused. "There's something else. The night before she died, Margaret came to the shelter. She was very sick, could barely walk. She gave me this." She handed me a small key. Said to give it to whoever spoke at her funeral with kindness. Said they'd know what to do with it. The key had a tag, Union Bank, Box 1247. After Eleanor left, we sat staring at this new key. How many more breadcrumbs had Margaret left? How deep did this maze go? "We should go to the police," Daniel said. "Show them everything." "With what?" I asked. "Receipts that prove Margaret was secretly charitable? Emails that Rosebridge will claim are fabricated? We need more." My phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mrs. Whitmore? This is Jennifer Chin, the woman who gave Margaret the Rosebridge files. We need to meet. Tonight. They know I helped her." We met Jennifer at an all-night diner, the kind where no one asks questions and the coffee tastes like regret. She was young, maybe 30, with the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept in days. "They fired me yesterday," she said. "Claimed I'd been embezzling, which is ironic considering what they do. But that's not why I'm here." She slid a flash drive across the table. "Margaret didn't get everything. This is the rest. Including the recordings." "Recordings?" Carlisle liked to record his meetings, thought it made him look powerful. He didn't know I was recording too. "There's one from the night Richard Whitmore died." We plugged the drive into Daniel's laptop right there in the diner. File after file of financial crimes, but it was the audio file dated 15 years ago that made Daniel's hands shake as he clicked play. Richard's voice, younger but recognizable. "This is wrong, Marcus. We're supposed to be helping these charities, not destroying them." Carlisle's reply, "We are helping them, Richard. Helping them understand their place in the ecosystem. The weak ones fail. The strong ones survive. That's business." "That's not what we agreed to. I'm pulling out. I'll go public if I have to." "No, you won't. Because your wife's reputation for cruelty makes her the perfect scapegoat. One word from me, and everyone will believe she's the one behind this. Your sons will be destroyed by association. Is your conscience worth that?" The sound of a door slamming. Then Carlisle's voice again, clearly speaking to someone else. "Make the call to Margaret. Tell her what her husband's planning. Let her handle him. She's good at that." Daniel closed the laptop, his face pale. "He killed him. Carlisle killed my father just as much as my mother did." Jennifer leaned forward. There's more. Fund M? It stands for Fund Margaret. Carlyle set it up in her name without her knowledge, used it to launder the money from the charities. When she found out after Richard's death, she couldn't expose it without implicating herself. So she decided to use it against them, I said, understanding dawning. She turned their weapon into hers. Exactly. But Carlyle has a failsafe. If Fund M is exposed, it looks like Margaret was the mastermind all along. Even in death, she'd take the fall. Unless, Daniel said slowly, we prove she was trying to stop it. We spent the rest of the night at that diner, planning. Jennifer knew Rosebridge's systems, I had Margaret's evidence, and Daniel had something neither of us expected, his mother's talent for strategic cruelty, inherited whether he wanted it or not. We need to make Carlyle overplay his hand, Daniel said. Mother would have baited him, made him so angry he'd make a mistake. How do we do that? Daniel smiled, and for the first time, I saw Margaret in him. We give him what he wants. We announce a public audit of the Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust, complete transparency. And we invite Rosebridge to oversee it, to ensure fairness. Jennifer laughed. He'll never agree to that. He will if we imply we've found irregularities in Margaret's donations. He'll think we're about to expose her and clear his name. The meeting was scheduled for Rosebridge's headquarters, a glass tower that looked like it was built from other people's broken dreams. Harold had insisted on coming, along with a court reporter he'd hired to create an official record. Remember, he said as we rode the elevator to the top floor, let them think they're winning until they've said too much to take back. The boardroom was intimidating by design, a massive oak table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and portraits of stern-faced men who'd probably stepped on countless backs to climb this high. Carlyle sat at the head of the table, flanked by lawyers like antibodies ready to attack any threat. Mrs. Whitmore, he smiled, all false warmth. I'm so pleased you've decided to be transparent about Margaret's activities. I set the cash box from Briar Station on the table. We want everything in the open. No secrets, no hidden agendas. Admirable, Carlyle said, his eyes fixed on the box. May I? I pushed it toward him. He opened it, rifling through the receipts with growing excitement. These are all Margaret's payments to various charities. Every one she made in secret. I confirmed. Secret payments, one of his lawyers repeated. That does raise questions about tax evasion, money laundering. Which is why we want Rosebridge's help, Daniel interrupted, playing his part perfectly. You knew her business better than anyone. You can help us understand what she was really doing. Carlyle leaned back, satisfied. Of course. We'll need full access to all her records, including Fund M. There it was. The first mention of the fund from his side. Fund M? I asked innocently. What's that? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Carlyle's face. A charitable fund Margaret established. Surely you've found records of it. Oh, that Fund M, Harold said smoothly. Yes, we have extensive records. In fact, we have the original incorporation documents. Would you like to see them? He produced a folder, sliding it across the table. Carlyle opened it, and his face went white. The documents showed his signature, not Margaret's, as the fund's creator. These are forgeries, he said immediately. Are they? Harold asked. Because we also have this. He played the recording from Jennifer's flash drive, Richard's confrontation with Carlyle filling the room. The lawyers started whispering frantically. Carlyle's composure cracked. That's inadmissible. Obtained illegally. Actually, Harold interrupted, it was obtained by Margaret Whitmore as part of her fiduciary duty to investigate financial irregularities in organizations her husband co-founded. Completely legal. I pulled out the folder of Rosebridge's internal emails. We also have these. Your discussions about which charities to target, how to extract maximum fees, how to use Fund M to hide the money. You can't prove. We can, Daniel said. He'd been quiet until now, but his voice carried Margaret's iron. We have Jennifer Chen's testimony. We have the bank records. We have the testimony of 17 charity directors you've defrauded. And we have this. He produced a document I hadn't seen before. Mother's affidavit, signed and notarized a week before her death. It details everything: how you manipulated my father, how you used his death to control her, how you've been bleeding Charities dry while she tried to stop you. That was a lie. There was no affidavit. But Carlyle didn't know that, and the bluff worked. "What do you want?" he asked, deflated. "Resignation," I said. "Immediate. Along with your entire board. Rosebridge's assets will be liquidated and distributed to the charities you've hurt. You'll sign a confession admitting to financial fraud. That would mean prison." "Yes," Harold said simply. "Or we can let the FBI sort it out. Your choice." Carlyle's lawyers huddled around him, whispering urgently. Finally, one of them spoke. "We need time to consider." "No," I said, channeling Margaret's imperious tone. "You decide now. Sign, or we leave and go directly to the FBI." It took 3 hours of negotiation, but in the end, Carlyle signed. He admitted to creating Fund M without Margaret's knowledge, to using her reputation as cover for his schemes, to defrauding dozens of charities. The confession was carefully worded to avoid the worst criminal charges, but it was enough to destroy him and Rosebridge. As we prepared to leave, Carlyle stopped me. "You think you've won? You think Margaret would be proud? She was just as much a monster as I am." "Yes," I agreed. "But she tried to stop being one. You never did." The next day, the news broke. Rosebridge's fraud, Carlyle's confession, the millions stolen from charities. It was the kind of scandal that dominated headlines for weeks. But buried in the coverage was another story: Margaret Whitmore's secret philanthropy, her quiet war against the very organization her husband had helped create. I stood in St. Catherine's Shelter, announcing the first grants from the Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust. Eleanor Washington was there, along with directors from a dozen other charities Rosebridge had targeted. Margaret Whitmore was a complicated woman, I said to the assembled group. She hurt people, sometimes irreparably. She was cruel, manipulative, and often unforgivable. But she also tried to make amends. Not perfectly, not completely, but she tried. This trust is her attempt to balance the scales she spent so long tipping. After the announcement, I visited Margaret's grave. Daniel came with me, carrying a bouquet of red roses, the ones she'd preferred. We stood there in silence for a long moment. "Do you think she planned all this?" Daniel asked. "Every bit of it." I thought about the breadcrumbs she'd left, the keys and documents and recordings. The way she'd predicted I'd lie at her funeral, counted on my compassion to trigger her final plan. "Yes," I said. "I think she planned it all." "Even the portrait?" He meant the one that had mysteriously appeared in our house. I laughed. "Especially the portrait. She probably paid someone to move it, knowing it would unsettle us enough to keep going." We laid the roses on her headstone. The inscription was simple: Margaret N. Whitmore. Wife. Mother. Complicated. That last word had been Daniel's addition, the only eulogy he could bring himself to give. As we walked back to the car, my phone rang. It was Jennifer Chun. "Sarah, I wanted you to know, I got a letter today. From a law firm I've never heard of. Margaret left me enough money to start over, to go back to school." The letter was dated a week before she died. After I hung up, Daniel asked what the call was about. "Another one of Margaret's plans coming to fruition," I said. "Will they ever stop?" I thought about the safety deposit box we hadn't opened yet, the one Eleanor's key led to. About the other names in Margaret's journal we hadn't reached out to yet. About the $47 million now sitting in a trust, waiting to heal wounds Margaret had both caused and tried to cure. "I hope not," I said. We drove home through streets Margaret had traveled, past buildings where she destroyed careers and saved livelihoods, through a city that would remember her as both devil and angel, never knowing she was always both at once. The portrait still hung in our hallway. Every morning, I passed it on my way to continue her work, not the cruelty, but the redemption. Every evening, Daniel and I would discuss the day's distributions, the charities saved, the wrongs slowly being righted. "She was a monster," Daniel said one night, staring at her portrait. "Yes," I agreed. But she was our monster. Yes. And maybe, in the end, she found a way to stop being one. I looked at Margaret's painted face, forever frozen in that knowing smile. Or maybe she found a way to make her monstrosity mean something. The Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust would continue for decades, long after the scandal faded, long after people forgot the woman behind it. But I would remember. I would remember the empty church, the lie I told to fill it, and the truth that lie revealed. Margaret had been right about one thing in her final message. Sometimes you know the truth only when you're forced to lie. And sometimes, the most beautiful lies we tell become the truths we choose to live. The conference room at Rosebridge headquarters had been transformed into a battlefield of documents. 3 weeks had passed since Carlyle's resignation, and now we sat across from his replacement, a sharp-eyed woman named Director Patricia Morse, who'd been brought in to clean up Rosebridge's image. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began, her voice silk over steel, "while we appreciate your enthusiasm for charitable work, these allegations against Rosebridge are quite serious. Mr. Carlyle may have confessed under duress, but—" "Under duress?" Harold interrupted. "We have recordings, documents, witness testimony. All obtained through Margaret Whitmore's criminal conspiracy," Morse countered smoothly. "She infiltrated our organization, stole private communications, and orchestrated a defamation campaign that continues even after her death." I laid the latest batch of receipts on the table, dozens more we'd found in the safety deposit box Eleanor's key had opened. These show Rosebridge billing charities for services never rendered. That's not defamation. That's evidence. "Evidence of Margaret's forgeries," Morse replied. "She was notorious for manipulation. Who's to say she didn't create these to frame us?" That's when I realized the trap. Carlyle might be gone, but Rosebridge itself was fighting back, trying to pin everything on the conveniently dead Margaret. They were going to make her the villain of the story, again. Daniel leaned forward. "You want to audit our books?"
"Fine.
"But we audit yours too. Complete transparency, both sides." Morse smiled. "Agreed. But I should warn you, if we find any irregularities in Margaret's finances, any hint that she was using charity funds for personal gain, we'll pursue criminal charges against her estate. Against you, specifically Mrs. Whitmore." After the meeting, Jennifer Chin met us in the parking garage. She looked terrified. "They're destroying evidence," she whispered. "My contact inside says they're shredding everything from the last 5 years, claiming it's routine document disposal." "We need those records," Harold said. "There's more," Jennifer continued. "They've found something called the M-Room files. Internal documents that supposedly prove Margaret was the mastermind all along." "That's impossible," Daniel said. "She didn't even know about Fund M until—" "They're forgeries," Jennifer interrupted. "But good ones. Good enough to convince a jury that your mother was the real villain and Rosebridge was her victim." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Margaret's note. "You know the truth when you're forced to lie." What truth? What lie? What was I missing? I went down to the dining room where we'd spread out all of Margaret's documents. There had to be something we'd overlooked, some piece of evidence that would. The portrait. Margaret's portrait was watching me from the hallway. And suddenly I understood. "Daniel." I shook him awake. "The portrait, it's not just a painting." We examined it carefully, running our hands along the frame. There, a small latch hidden in the gilt scrollwork. The backing opened to reveal a hidden compartment containing a single USB drive and a note. "For when they make me the villain again." The drive contained video files, Margaret's personal recordings spanning 5 years. We watched her confession, her real one, not performed for lawyers or family, but spoken to herself in the dark of her study. "My name is Margaret Ann Whitmore," her image said, looking directly at the camera. "And I am guilty of terrible things. I destroyed Patricia Carson's marriage out of jealousy. I ruined Robert Thompson's career because he embarrassed me at a party. I turned my sons against each other for my own amusement. I am exactly the monster everyone believes me to be." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I am also guilty of trying to stop being that monster. When Marcus Carlyle told me my husband's death was my fault, that my cruelty had killed him, something broke in me. Or maybe something finally fixed itself. I couldn't stop being cruel. It's like an addiction, a compulsion I've never been able to control. But I could try to balance it. For every person I hurt, I could help someone else. Not the same person. That would require apologies I'm incapable of making. But someone. Anyone. The next video was dated a year later. Carlisle thinks he owns me. He thinks because Fundem is in my name, because he has evidence of my cruelties, that I'll stay quiet about Rosebridge's theft. He's wrong. I've been documenting everything. Every penny they steal. Every charity they destroy. When I die, because I'll never have the courage to do this while I'm alive, someone will use this evidence. Someone better than me. Someone who can look at the worst person they know and still choose kindness. She looked directly at the camera. Sarah, if you're watching this, it means you lied beautifully at my funeral. It means you found something worth saving in someone who wasn't worth saving. That's the test. Not whether you could lie, but whether you could find grace for the graceless. You passed. The final video was dated a week before her death. Rosebridge will try to make me the villain when this comes out. They're not entirely wrong. I am a villain. But I'm not their villain. The M-Room files they'll produce are forgeries. The real files are hidden in a place they'll never think to look, inside the foundation stones of St. Mary's Shelter. The shelter I helped build 30 years ago, before I became the monster everyone knows. Before Richard's ambition and my cruelty poisoned everything we touched. She provided detailed instructions on where to find the hidden documents. Then, at the end, she said something that made Daniel grip my hand. I know my sons will never forgive me. I don't deserve their forgiveness. But maybe through Sarah, they can forgive themselves for not being able to love me. That's all any mother should want, for her children to be free of her sins. The next morning, we returned to St. Mary's Shelter with a construction crew. Eleanor Washington watched nervously as they carefully removed a section of the foundation stone in the basement. Behind it, wrapped in waterproof plastic, were the original Rosebridge Incorporation documents, the real M-Room files, and something unexpected, love letters between Richard and Margaret from before they were married. In one letter, Richard wrote, "My darling Margaret, your kindness to the children at the shelter today showed me your true heart. Never let the world make you hard." In her reply, "Dear Richard, the world has already made me hard. But perhaps, with you, I can remember how to be soft." Daniel read them with tears streaming down his face. She was different once. They both were. Harold examined the legal documents. This proves everything. Carlisle created Fundem without Margaret's knowledge or consent. These are his signatures, his authorizations. And here, correspondence showing he threatened Richard with destroying Margaret if he didn't comply. So they were both victims, I said. Carlisle used their weaknesses against each other. No, Daniel said firmly. Mother made her choices. She chose cruelty. But maybe she also chose redemption, even if she couldn't fully achieve it. We presented everything at the emergency board meeting Director Morse had called. The room was packed with lawyers, charity representatives, and media. Morse had clearly planned this as Rosebridge's vindication, their moment to prove Margaret was the true villain. Ladies and gentlemen, Morse began, we have evidence that Margaret Whitmore orchestrated a decades-long fraud. No, I interrupted, standing up. You have forgeries. We have the originals. Harold distributed copies of the real documents while I played Margaret's confession videos on the conference room screen. The room watched in stunned silence as Margaret admitted to her cruelties, but also exposed Rosebridge's crimes. She was a complicated woman, I said when the videos ended.
Cruel, yes.
Manipulative, absolutely. But she was also someone who tried to atone for her sins, imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely. Rosebridge, on the other hand, never tried to atone for anything. They just got better at hiding their crimes. Morse tried to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. The original documents showed Carlisle's signature everywhere Margaret's was supposed to be. The real M-Room files detailed Rosebridge's systematic theft. And Margaret's videos, painful as they were to watch, showed a woman aware of her faults trying to make amends. "This is the truth," I said, addressing the room but looking at Morse. Margaret Whitmore was a villain who tried to become a hero and only managed to become human. Rosebridge is a villain that's still pretending to be a hero, which is worse. The vote was unanimous. Rosebridge's board was dissolved. Its assets were seized and redistributed to the charities it had defrauded. Director Morse was escorted out by security, but not before she leaned close to me and whispered, "You think you've won? There are hundreds of organizations, like Rosebridge. You've only stopped one. Then we'll stop the others," I replied. "One at a time." It's what Margaret would have wanted. Margaret was a monster. Yes, I agreed. But she was a monster who learned to bite other monsters. That's a kind of redemption. The courtroom was packed for the final hearing. 6 months had passed since Margaret's funeral, and now a judge would decide whether the Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust would stand or whether the cousins' lawsuit to overturn the will would succeed. "Your Honor," the cousin's lawyer argued, "Mrs. Sarah Whitmore gained this inheritance through fraud. She lied at the funeral, triggering a will clause that should never have activated." Judge Harrison, a stern woman with piercing eyes, looked at me. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you lie at your mother-in-law's funeral?" I stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I said she was charitable when I believed she wasn't. I said she helped others when I thought she only hurt them. I lied because I couldn't bear to see someone buried with only hatred as their eulogy." "But the lie turned out to be true," Daniel added, standing beside me. "My mother was charitable, secretly. She did help others, imperfectly." Sarah's fiction revealed a truth none of us knew. James stood up from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I hated my mother. She made my life hell. But even I can see that Sarah earned this inheritance. Not by lying, but by being the only person willing to show mercy to someone who never showed it to others." Patricia spoke next. "Margaret destroyed my marriage. But she also paid for my children's therapy and education. She was both poison and cure. Sarah is the only one who understood that." Even Eleanor Washington had come. "Your Honor, Margaret Whitmore saved my shelter 7 times. She also nearly destroyed it once. She was complicated, but the trust Sarah manages has already saved 12 charities from bankruptcy. That's real good coming from real pain." The judge deliberated for an hour. When she returned, her expression was thoughtful. "This case asks us to consider the nature of truth and lies, of redemption and justice. Margaret Whitmore was, by all accounts, a difficult woman who caused significant harm. She was also, we now know, someone who tried to make amends for that harm. Mrs. Sarah Whitmore told what she believed was a lie that turned out to contain truth. More importantly, she has proven herself a worthy steward of the trust." She paused, looking at the cousins. "The will stands. The Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust remains under Sarah Whitmore's control." The cousins stormed out, but one, a younger woman named Rebecca, stayed behind. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "About the lawsuit. About everything. I wanted something from her. Even after death, I wanted her to choose me." "She did," I said, pulling out a small envelope with Rebecca's name on it. This was in the safety deposit box. "She left something for everyone. She just hid it behind tests and games because she couldn't do anything simply." Rebecca opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph of Margaret holding Rebecca as a baby and a note. "You are the only one who never feared me. I'm sorry I gave you reason to. Use your anger at me to be better." There was also a check for $50,000 and a scholarship fund in Rebecca's name for young women pursuing law degrees. "She remembered that I wanted to be a lawyer," Rebecca whispered, "before she turned the whole family against me." "She remembered everything," Daniel said. "The good and the bad. She just didn't know how to show love without causing pain." The trust's work continued. We established the M-Room Foundation, named ironically after Rosebridge's secret fund, to provide emergency grants to charities in crisis. The first recipients were all organizations Rosebridge had targeted. A year after the funeral, we held a memorial service for Margaret. Not a funeral, but a reckoning. We invited everyone she'd hurt and everyone she'd helped. The church that had been empty for her funeral was now full of complicated feelings and complicated people. I stood at the podium where I'd once told beautiful lies. Margaret Whitmore was not a good person, I began. She was cruel, manipulative, and destructive. She ruined careers, destroyed relationships, and left scars that will never fully heal. All of that is true. I paused, looking at the assembled crowd, victims and beneficiaries alike. But she was also someone who recognized her own evil and tried, however imperfectly, to balance the scales. She couldn't stop being cruel, but she could choose to also be kind. She couldn't undo the harm she caused, but she could try to prevent others from causing more harm. She was both the problem and a flawed attempt at a solution. Daniel spoke next. My mother never told me she loved me, but she left me evidence that she tried to love, even if she failed. She left me the truth about herself, all of it, the good and the bad, and trusted me to decide what to do with it. That's its own kind of love. James added. She made me into her weapon, then regretted what I'd become. The trust Sarah manages is trying to help people like me, people damaged by their parents' ambitions. It doesn't erase what she did, but it helps prevent others from doing the same. After the service, Harold handed me one final envelope. She said to give you this only after you'd proven the trust would survive all challenges. Inside was a simple card with Margaret's handwriting. Sarah, you asked why I chose you. The answer is simple. In a room full of people who had every reason to speak, you were the only one who spoke without reason, out of pure compassion. You lied to give comfort to the uncomforted, even when that person was me. The truth about my cruelty is that it was compulsive, uncontrollable, like breathing. The truth about my charity is that it was calculated, forced, like holding my breath. But both were real. Both were me. You have inherited not my wealth, but my war. The war between who we are and who we choose to be. Fight it better than I did. Win it if you can. And thank you for the beautiful lie. It was the kindest thing anyone ever did for me. Margaret. 5 years have passed now. The Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust has distributed over $100 million to charities across the country. We've exposed 3 more organizations like Rosebridge. We've helped hundreds of people Margaret hurt and thousands she never knew. Daniel and I have 2 children now. We've told them about their grandmother. All of it, when they're old enough to understand. We want them to know that people can be both terrible and trying, that redemption isn't a destination but a direction, that sometimes the most beautiful lies we tell become the truths we live. The portrait still hangs in our hallway. But we've added others. Pictures of the people the trust has helped, the charities saved, the good that's grown from poisoned soil. Margaret's cold smile is now surrounded by warm ones, her isolated portrait part of a larger gallery of complicated grace. Sometimes, late at night, I stand before her portrait and think about that empty church, about the eulogy I invented, about the woman who is exactly as awful as everyone knew and exactly as complex as no one imagined. You passed the test, I tell her painted face. You wanted to know if someone could show you mercy despite everything. I did. But more importantly, you showed yourself mercy by trying to change, even if you couldn't fully succeed. The portrait, of course, doesn't respond. But sometimes I imagine Margaret's ghost standing beside me, still critical, still complicated, but finally at peace with the truth that she was both the villain and the author of her own imperfect redemption. The Margaret Whitmore Charitable Trust's mission statement, which hangs in our office, reads, dedicated to the belief that people can be both broken and building, both harmful and healing, and that the distance between who we are and who we choose to be is measured not in perfection but in effort. Below it, in smaller text, founded on a beautiful lie that became a complicated truth. Eleanor Washington, now a board member of the trust, often says, Margaret Whitmore was the worst person I knew who tried to become better. That's more than most good people ever attempt. And that, perhaps, is the final truth about Margaret Whitmore. She was a monster who couldn't stop being monstrous, but who could choose to also be something else. She was cruel and kind, destructive and constructive, the problem and the partial solution. She was human in the messiest, most difficult way possible. She was exactly who I said she was at her funeral, someone who dedicated herself to charity, who helped others without seeking recognition. I just hadn't known I was telling the truth when I said it. The beautiful lie I told at Margaret's funeral has become the complicated truth we live. Every grant we make, every charity we save, every wrong we try to right, it all stems from that moment when I stood in an empty church and chose to find grace for the graceless. Margaret was right about one thing. You know the truth when you're forced to lie. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very careful, the lie you tell becomes the truth you make. The trust continues. The work continues. The redemption, partial, imperfect, but real, continues. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, I hope Margaret Whitmore finally knows what she never believed in life, that she was worth the beautiful lie, worth the effort to find good in her evil, worth the chance at redemption she gave herself through us. She was a nasty woman who left behind a complicated grace. And that, in the end, is perhaps the most anyone can hope for, to be remembered not just for what we were, but for what we tried to become. If you had to choose between letting someone be buried with only hatred as their legacy or telling a compassionate lie about them, what would you do? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about the complicated truths hidden behind family secrets.